Hello, YouTubers out there. This is Jerry Saravia at the movies. So, before I discuss the Fabelmans box office performance, which usually has some interest to me, but in the past I used to read a lot about these box office industry speculators, speculations, analysts who oversee everything about box office, and but this one interests me because it is directed by Steven Spielberg, this film, and it's considered pretty much a box office flop. As of now, it has grossed $12 million dollars and it's been playing for, hang on a second here, for 8 weeks. Now, 12 million, okay, it's a Universal picture, but the film's budget is $40 million dollars. And if you take into account marketing budget, that is to say advertising, trailers, that sort of thing, I believe they usually estimate it's half of the original budget, which I don't know how they reached that estimation, to be honest with you. So that would be an additional 20 million added to 40. That's $60 million that was spent on everything with regards to the Fabelmans. So let's go back in time and understand box office. Now, Forrest Gump was the most popular film of 1994. I mean, it had the biggest box office earnings. It certainly made its money back. I think domestically, if I'm not mistaken, was 674 million. Internationally, more than that, I believe. But it was certainly a high number. The producers of that film, well, let's just say the executives, the studio executives, said the film was in the red. Some of you might know about this, but back then they made this declaration on an interview in Entertainment Weekly back in 1995, and they said the film was in the red, despite the box office earnings. So what actually happened was that the author of the film, or the book rather, that Forrest Gump was based on, the author being Winston Groom, who also wrote a sequel to that book, was promised, I think, somewhere between 1.1 and 3% of the film's box office earnings. And he was waiting for the money because this is what he was promised. This was part of the deal with regards to this book. It's got Tom Hanks, it's got director Robert Zemeckis, and of course it was huge, so he should be receiving money. He didn't receive a cent. Why? Because the executives said, the film is in the red, sorry. So he had to go to court, and eventually he did reach a settlement. So ever since then, I've always thought that, you know what, they're not telling us everything we need to know about box office. Now, that doesn't help explain what's going on with the Fabelmans, but you'll get what I'm saying in just a moment. I read an article recently, which I never thought of before, and I've read many things about box office earnings. I don't know why. I mean, still the most popular film adjusted for inflation in the history of cinema, that is to say domestically, is Gone with the Wind. And that came out in 1939. And in fact, that film sold more tickets on average than almost any other film. That includes Dr. Zhivago, which technically still made more money, if I'm not mistaken, than even the original, than Titanic. And that was from 1965. But this article illustrated something which I thought was interesting. The number of tickets sold is not taken into account. And also, the price per ticket is also not taken into account. Not really, because the prices change. So if you go to a discount theater, for example, to see a movie that's playing on the second run, it's going to cost less. Say, even nowadays, a discount theater would probably charge you about $5, maybe $7. AMC charges about $10. $9 if you go to a matinee at the AMC theaters. Later on, the price goes up. And So this is not even taking into account concessions and all this other stuff that the theaters sometimes make money off of, which is mostly the concessions, not so much the tickets sold for a movie. Because the exhibitors know that a movie, generally speaking, first run, commercial picture, Hollywood film, even a comic book movie now, will last a few weeks in theaters, if that. But generally, it's out before you know it to make room for other stuff. So, even though it's a multiplex, an average comic book movie, let's say, and we're talking comic books because that's mostly what people go to see nowadays, they open in not one theater, not two theaters, but sometimes three or four screens, I should say, 3 or 4 screens in one theater. So there again, the prices change, don't they? So standard 2D, then possibly if it's converted to 3D, there's that too. That costs more money. I remember because I saw Mad Max Fury Road back in 2015 in 3D, which I wish I had, because the 3D wasn't really that terrifically impressive. And that cost about $17, $18. That was the first showing. So, and then there was IMAX, and then IMAX 3D. Usually IMAX would have the 3D, I think, only. But so those are all different prices. But they don't take into account, as this article I had read recently, take into account the number of tickets sold. And the studios don't want that information out there. They don't tell you that. I mean, the information is available technically, but it has nothing to do with anything and the difference in prices, right? So this is true of anything in retail, really. If you think about it, you could buy a bar of Dial soap at one location that costs, let's say, I don't know, for a pack of 5, maybe $3.50, $4.50, and somewhere else at Target could be more money, and then Walmart could charge less, and this and that and the other. It's the same thing with movies. Same exact thing. So now, in terms of box office earnings, here's the thing. So let's take into account the Fabelmans, which is mostly what we're going to try to discuss. That film cost $40 million. Now, back in the day, it used to be the film has to make 1.5 to 2 times its original cost to break even, which would technically include the addition of the marketing budget. So in the case of the Fabelmans, let's say 40 million plus 20 million, let's say, for marketing. So, and if somebody out there wants to correct me on that, go ahead. Tell me the real truth about the Fabelmans, because I don't know what exactly is the marketing budget. I'm only taking into account what has been said, especially now. Marketing budget. Not so much in the past, because I never really thought about marketing budget in the past. So, $60 million. That means the film should have made about $180 million. Some people believe it has to be at least 3 times its original cost. Some say 2.5 times. Some say 1.5 times. Some say, well, if it cost $60 million, it made about $65 million at the box office. It's doing pretty good, which is what one article said. So the reasoning or the logistics or the math, it changes when it's a lower budgeted picture. So, for example, back in the day in 1990, look at the film Ghost. Ghost cost about $25 million, the budget. Not counting, let's say, the marketing. So let's say the marketing, maybe an additional 10 million, let's say, for the sake of argument. So 30 million. That film grossed over 200 million domestically. Huge hit. Blair Witch Project is technically one of the biggest financial hits of all time, based on the original budget. Now, when you take into account original budget, the fact that they had this internet marketing campaign, plus the release of a documentary called Curse of the Blair Witch, which was shown on Sci-Fi at the time, all that put together would still be based on the fact that the original budget of the film was $150,000, something like that. Or no, I'm sorry, it was like $25,000. It was real cheap. So let's say altogether over $1 million, which would be the case of, say, something like El Mariachi by Robert Rodriguez, his first film, which cost, with marketing and everything else, showing in theaters, over $1 million, maybe $2 million will be. We'll give it that much. That Blair Witch Project made over $150 million domestically. And I think even more than that, probably. So, Fabelmans needed to at least make, if you take into account what some speculators out there say, box office analysts, at least 45, 50 million. The film so far, as of now, made 12 million, close to $13 million in 8 weeks. Comparatively speaking, look at The Whale, which is a new film by Darren Aronofsky, a very good director, starring Brendan Fraser. This film has opened in 6 theaters initially, made $332,000. It's been in release now for 4 weeks in 835 theaters, and it's made close to $7.5 million. Now, the original budget for The Whale was $3 million. Now, if you take into account marketing, let's say altogether maybe $5 million, maybe a little more. So this is considered now kind of a real success, people say. See that? So 3 million, box office 7 million. Oh, this is a success. But The Fabelmans has already made more money than The Whale, but it's cost much more money to make. And it's a Steven Spielberg production. Although 40 million is fairly low for even Steven Spielberg. And still considered a box office failure. Now let's move on to something I find always interesting, which is not so much the number of tickets sold, but the per screen average of a movie in a theater. So, The Fabelmans opened in 4 theaters and made $161,579. This was the initial week. So I'm looking here at Box Office Mojo, which really breaks it down beautifully. So in 4 theaters, it was ranked number 16, outside of the top 10. The per screen average was 50. I think I'm reading that correctly. I'm sorry if I'm not. The daily per screen average was $59,567. So the following day was 57,000, and then it kept going lower and lower. 44,000, 16,000, 17,000, 14,000, still playing only in 4 screens. Then eventually, by November 18th, it went up to 31,000, and then the following day up to 35,000. That was on a weekend. Then 22,000 on a Sunday, and then Monday 10,000, which traditionally during the week a movie doesn't make a whole lot of money then. But then look at this. The movie then opened in 600 screens, and Tuesday, November 17th, it made $9,300. Then it opened in 38 more screens. The following day, it went up to $398,000 per screen average. We're still talking about The Fabelmans. This is early on. So they weren't quite sure what to make of any of this yet. Okay. And then was 473,000, and so on and so forth. The numbers went up, then that it would decrease, then it seemed to go up again, and then decrease. Still playing in 638 screens. Now, then by the time December 9th rolled around, which was a Friday, it opened in 973 screens, and the daily average, so this is, I guess, all the theaters combined, was 341,000. So technically, I'm looking at this slightly wrong, but it was $350 per screen average, if I'm reading this correctly. I think I am. But then again, then it jumped up to 507,000, and you can see in the green numbers, it goes up, the percentage. When it's red, it decreases. But then in December 13th, it was 203,000. But again, the per screen averages were fairly low. But the daily average for all those theaters. So, yes, it was a failure. Not many people were going to see the Fabelmans. So by now, the daily average reached 160,000 as of Friday. But that's a jump of 47.4%, and that's in 998 theaters. So actually, during from December 23rd to January 5th, it was playing between 1,122 screens and 1,149 screens, and now it's decreased to 998 screens, $160. 12 million, 13 million, close to making. Now, let's move on back to the beginning. So, the daily average per screen in November 11th was 59,000. That was daily. The average was $14,891 per screen. So that was already seen as like gaining interest, despite the fact that the daily average was different. It was still only 4 theaters. I mean, what are you going to do with 4 theaters? So, but when we think back, so we'll think back now, and I believe that was a daily average, but if I remember correctly, they even said it was per screen. So you can correct me out there, anyone who knows for sure. Booksmart opened against Aladdin. Booksmart was a smaller picture and a very good film by director Olivia Wilde. I believe was her directorial debut. And Booksmart was making about 50,000, maybe a little less than that, per screen average, not daily, per screen. Aladdin was making about close to 60,000 per screen average. Booksmart didn't open in nearly as many theaters as Aladdin, but it's interesting to see that. So this is the type of thing that is sometimes discussed, but not often enough if you care for that sort of thing. Box office earnings. But what is even of more paramount importance, I think, is the number of tickets sold. The Fabelmans, unfortunately, is a box office failure. It's just nobody's going to see this movie. And it's unlikely to gain a whole lot more traction. Now that it's only playing in 998 theaters, that's it. It's a failure. But it's a failure not because of quality of the film, but the box office. And based on the original budget, and when you take into consideration marketing budget, it's a failure. There may be reasons for that. Maybe if the film was called The Spielbergs, it would have done better. It is a Steven Spielberg film, but that doesn't guarantee an audience anymore. Because last year, West Side Story came out around the same time. That was his remake, and it made $38 million domestically. It was not a runaway success, because I think the film cost close to $90 million to make. So, and even though it has the pedigree of a Steven Spielberg film, it wasn't enough. So, others say, well, prestige pictures don't make much, but on the other hand, well, okay, The Whale is not a huge blockbuster, but that's considered a steadily increasing success of a movie, even though it's only grossed $7 million thus far. So it's always about the budget. This is what they look at, and that's what they compare it to. Now, that's important for the executives to know, but for the rest of us, it doesn't mean very much, and hence why this type of thing is it's fascinating, but it doesn't tell you everything. It doesn't tell you about the quality of the film. The Fabelmans actually sounds like the name of a department store. With all due respect, to the movie, which I like. It's a very good movie, but maybe that just wasn't, it's just not something. It's kind of like it happened to Spielberg before with the BFG. Now that's based on a Roald doll, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, doll classic, The Big Friendly Giant, which was also known as the BFG. That's what that means. But there were people who had no idea what the BFG meant, and so they didn't go see it. Um, Sometimes that happens, you know. But I don't. I'll be honest with you. These probably are accurate statistics, but I don't always trust the studio themselves. They like to sell themselves short sometimes, and then sometimes they like to declare something a bigger success than it really is. Case in point would be, well, really any time that I can remember when they are number one, they adjust their earnings just a little bit, when in fact then there are people out there who, uh, like an oversight committee, will see that no, 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 you didn't make quite what you thought you'd made, type thing. So anyway, that's what I got to say about that. If none of this made any sense to you, well, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me either. It is fascinating, but a bit, of a headache to keep track of this type of thing, because I'm not always good with numbers. But if you have any thoughts on this, or the Fabelmans box office, or if I'm not reading this correctly, but I think I am. This is Box Office Mojo. I think this is somewhat correct. Um, but what are your thoughts on box office? Do you think the industry is not telling us everything? That they are fudging the numbers a little bit here and there, or not? Let me your thoughts. Tell me what you think, and if you have any other inside information out there about this sort of thing, I'd like to hear about it. So that's it. If you like my channel, please subscribe to my Jerry the Movies channel. And I guess that's all I got to say for now. And this is Jerry Saravia the Movies, signing off.